Hey everybody, this is Heidi, and you're listening to the Successful Fashion Designer Podcast. We all know that the fashion industry is brutally competitive and it takes loads of hard work to get ahead. The problem is that everyone's secretive and tight-lipped about their ways. After working as a designer and educator for over a decade, I wanted to help break down those barriers and bring you valuable knowledge from industry experts, and this show is exactly where you'll find that. Whether you're trying to break into the fashion world, make yourself more marketable, launch your own label, or become a successful freelancer, we'll help you get ahead in the cutthroat fashion industry. This is episode 23 of the Successful Fashion Designer Podcast, and today I'm chatting with Solomon Eversole, Visual Merchandising Director for AG Jeans. This is part one of two parts of my interview with Solomon, and in this conversation, we discuss the creative process. With 15 years of corporate experience in the fashion industry, Solomon has figured out what really works to help himself and his team find and express their best creativity in an industry where we're constantly battling tight deadlines, late nights, and rushed projects. In the interview, you'll learn how to relieve yourself of creative pressure, why planning is one of the most essential things you can do to access and express your artistic side, and why the creative process can't be done in a vacuum.
If we function in this creative world, we have to remember that we function in a creative world, right? We are not islands. And our job is actually to be collaborative, because if we want the end result to be inspiring, then the process needs to be inspiring as well. So ideally, we're pulling in people who know more than us.
Before we jump into the interview, I have a quick favor to ask you. If you enjoy this episode, the best way you can say thank you and give back is by subscribing and reviewing the show on iTunes. It only takes 60 seconds, but this small effort really helps the show grow and get discovered by more listeners. Visit sfdnetwork.com/subscribe to do that now. I'd really appreciate it. To access the show notes for today's episode, visit sfdnetwork.com/23. Now on to the interview with Solomon. Welcome, Solomon, to the Successful Fashion Designer Podcast. I would love to start with you introducing yourself to the audience and telling everybody about what you do in the fashion industry.
Thank you for having me. I'm super excited about this. So I am visual director at AG Jeans, and then I have a capsule collection under the label Solomon Eversole.
Awesome. And I'd love for you to kind of start out with talking about your approach to creativity. So, you and I have had some conversations before, and I know you lead a team of designers and you really push them to get creative, to experiment, to explore new experiences. And this is something I hear from designers in my audience a lot, and just people in the industry, coworkers and people I collaborate with, is how do you maintain creativity in an industry where we are constantly behind, we're battling deadlines, we're frantic to get stuff done, and it can be really easy to let the creativity be the thing that gets pushed to the bottom of the list. And from some of the stuff you've told me in the past, you do a great job with yourself and your team of making sure that that doesn't get pushed to the bottom of the list, because working in an industry like fashion, that's an essential skill and an essential sort of muscle we have to flex. And so can you talk a little bit about the creative process and how you guys keep yourself fresh?
Yeah, certainly. So I think it's probably important to note where I come from creatively, and where I come from professionally. So, I was a bright young wild child who couldn't decide between being an intellectual and being an artist. And so I spent my entire youth, maybe up into my mid-20s, battling between these two identities. Like, am I smart or am I talented? As though they were mutually exclusive. Mm-hmm. Am I a business-minded, budget-centric communicator, or am I an inspirer, a thriver, a creator, an eccentric? And so what ended up happening with me is I sort of wound my way from the performing and the visual arts into a very, very corporate position that required me to be creative and flex my intellectual muscle, to figure out how to communicate to people who are not creative things that to me seemed abstract and visceral. Mm-hmm. So I would stand with people who they were salespeople. All they really knew how to do was get a customer to buy something that they didn't come into the store wanting. And I do that from a creative perspective, non-verbally, in my role as a visual director. And so to teach people how to do that without having to say anything, in the placement of product and how you present something, in the positioning of lighting, in how you convince a customer to wind through a store. And so in my current life, both as designing my own line and in managing a team at a fashion brand and helping them become really like happy, vibrant creatives, to me it's this balance. I definitely believe that creativity, or that most of the creative work that we do is 80 to 90% logic, right? So even when you lay out a painting, it's about this composition. Like, how do you create tension? Where are your principal figures placed? What are your foreground, middle ground, background? How do you create that? And then there's this spark that as creatives we are blessed with, which is we can take something that seems completely invisible, we can draw it through ourselves and apply it to that canvas, something that 80 to 90% of logic couldn't have predicted. The wabi-sabi element, the umami, if you will. And so with my team, we are definitely in a quote unquote deadline-driven business. So with my intellectual background, what I realize in helping motivate them is that I need to give them longer lead times so that there's more space to explore. Mm-hmm. Because as creatives, we need to dance, we need to feel the space. It should be noted that I come from, I was a dancer when I was a ballerina up until the time I was in my 20s. Mm. A lot of the language that I use is around the music, the movement, the filling of the space that I learned in a physical manifestation of my creative process. And now I do it it's much more tactical. It's much more present and less ephemeral. So with my team, I definitely am. I empower them to be planful and playful. And so, typically nowadays, we know what spring 2019 is going to look like. We're already in that. Mm-hmm. So we shouldn't be doing things the night before we present everything for spring 19. Because why? Why would we want to stress ourselves out like that? That sounds like a terrible way to live. There are plenty of things that will become urgent on their own. So anything that we can affect that we can have space with, where we can go on inspiration trip after inspiration trip and tweak the initial idea, and then it's fully expressed months in advance.
Yeah.
And we're not stressful, or we're not stressed or anxious.
Yeah. So, go ahead. Sorry.
No, Europe.
Okay. So the longer lead times and you shared something with me in a previous conversation. I think it's called the 6 Ps. Can you just share that really quickly?
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. Being that I've been in the corporate world for so long, because now I think, good grief, this February, it'll be like almost 15 years that I've been somehow attached to a corporate environment. Mm-hmm. I've worked with a lot of CEOs and CFOs and COOs and lots of people with C's in front of their title. And this one woman, Susan Kellogg, who was really dynamic, is really dynamic and inspiring. She one day very flippantly just said, I really definitely believe in the 6 Ps. And I asked for further information, and she said, well, it stands for proper planning prevents piss poor performance. Mm-hmm. And I'm definitely a fan of those dumb idioms that help motivate a team without having to be like too heavy-handed. I used to have this compositional exercise with people who had never experienced composition, where it'd say diamonds, diagonals, and pyramids. Oh my! And then we would, as though we were in the Wizard of Oz, walk through the store and just be like, diamonds, diagonals, and pyramids. Oh my! Because it should be that fun. And so Susan, hands me this like gem of an idiom: proper planning prevents piss poor performance. And it made the objective of planning much less anxiety riddled. Because it's like, oh yeah, well, this is coming up. So 6 months from now we have, and we need to be ready for it. Cool. Let's get ready.
Yeah. And so is that where, like, maybe if I interpret that correctly, it's like, instead of just thinking about planning, because some people just don't want to plan, I think especially creatives, they just want to work on their own schedule and on a whim. And I speak for myself partially and other people out there. I actually feel like I tend to lean more business than creative, although I do have pieces and parts of the creativity in me. That planning can sound like something really boring and annoying and a chore that we don't want to do. Yeah. But if we approach it with this mindset of it prevents piss poor performance, then we're a little more excited about it, because we know the end result of what the planning is going to give us. It's going to give us a great outcome. It's going to give us longer lead times. It's going to give us the time to have the creative freedom. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, because I think planning gets a bad name, because it sounds so boring. But Twyla Tharp wrote this really, really exceptional book for creatives that is called, don't quote me on this, but it's Twyla Tharp. It's something about developing the creative habit,
okay.
Right? Which puts this into two separate, two strange ideas, right? Creativity and habit. So something that sounds fun, something that sounds boring. But she has these ways of helping you get into the creative process. And what planning is really doing is it's removing obstacles that are, in my opinion, it's removing obstacles that get in the way of us being creative. Right? So if in the middle of, if in the middle of choreographing, I'm searching for that piece of music that I forgot to pick up, then I've just wasted, precious rehearsal time. If in the middle of a painting, I'm looking for cadmium blue when I know that it's necessary for the painting, then I've wasted precious creative time that I could be playing in cadmium blue. And so that's I don't believe as creatives we're supposed to think about the end result of what we're doing. The creative process for me is definitely process based, but if I can eliminate as many obstacles as possible that allow me to play so that there can be an end result, then we're good. Like, I'm in the midst of developing a pretty aggressive holiday window. Like, it's a big rollout. I've been mainly using third-party fabricators, and I had this idea the other day. Now, mind you, we're still over 90 days. Oh no, that's not right. We're 60 days before we roll this thing out. Mm-hmm. And so I have all the bids. I know what the numbers are. I know what the materials are going to be. And then I had this idea that to me makes it much more interesting and much more evolved. And I still have time to affect that because I don't actually have to be in production for another 25 days. And that is such a relief. And so I have no idea what the end result of this window is going to look like. I don't know how it's going to execute. Like, it may be shit for all I know. Who knows? That's none of my business. But everything that I need is currently in place. So now I have time to let it evolve and prototype and see how it feels and make a physical prototype, walk through it, look at it, touch, feel, taste it, shift things, so that when we get to delivery and installation nationwide, it's something that is bigger than I am. In the end, I believe that that's what ends up happening with us creatively is we create these things, or we think we create these things, we channel these things. They're so much greater than we could have imagined them in our small intellectual minds.
And what I also heard you say there was that, it allows room for these, like, your body like jolts awake in the middle of the night with this amazing idea of like, wait, what if we did it this way? And that planning and that time gives you the opportunity to explore that versus if you're running so last minute, you'll never have that opportunity. You might not have even had that idea that right now working 60 days in advance, you've got 25 more days before you've got to really pull the trigger and say, okay, everything's going into production. And you have the opportunity to sort of play and mold and wait, no, let's pivot here, to use a business marketing term, pivot. Yeah. But it gives you the liberty of that, right? I'm such a nerd. Let's pivot our creativity.
So most of the creative theorizing that I have come into, or that I utilize, is definitely like borrowed or adopted from other people. So I worked with this man who does not come from a creative background. I worked under him at Seven for All Mankind. He is a visual director. He's very, very skilled. He acknowledges that his creativity is limited, and he makes sure that he has like artists, I put that in quotation marks, underneath him to really help explore that creativity. But he talks about this idea that to me is very business, which he calls it the 80% rule. And I now teach this to anybody that I work with in any capacity, because I think it's necessary in getting rid of the onus of having to meet perfection, like eye to eye, is that if you start from zero, you can only ever get to 80%. So the first person who walks into a store and merchandises it, the first person who lays down their sketches for a new line, the first person to approach the choreographic realm can only take it to 80%. The next person who comes in can take it all the way to 100, 110, 150, 200, because their zero is now 80%.
Wow.
Which is why I actually think Apple is so successful, because they're not inventing anything new. They're starting at somebody else's 80%, and they're going, all right, we're going to blow this out of the water. Because all we're going to do is we're going to tweak this idea so that it's even more effective, so that it's even more magical, so that it's even more superlative. And so, and this is part of that proper planning prevents piss poor performance, is that if I walk in on Monday and I can get it to 80%, and then I go home, I sleep, I wake up the next day, and then I walk in on Tuesday, I'm the guy starting at 80 as my zero. I'm the guy who gets to take it to 100% because I am the fresh set of eyes. We talk about that a lot. It just needs a fresh set of eyes, and if I allow myself the room, if I am planful in my creative process, then I can be that fresh set of eyes. I give myself the room to take it further, to drop the and the and make it like a beautiful, succinct poem.
As I start with
We all do.
We all do, right? So it's interesting because as you were first saying that, starting at 80%, and then you're able to take it to the 150, 200, whatever number beyond 100, my first thought was, okay, so you start with something. Maybe you don't start with a blank page. Like, you have to start with some type of inspiration that perhaps you've borrowed from other people, and that's fine because everything at one point or another gets recycled. Nothing is new anymore. And so you made the reference with Apple. They take someone's idea and then they just explode it. And so I think there's something to be said, or what I took out of that was, you could start at a blank sheet of paper. I'd be curious to hear, how you and your team start. Do you start at a blank sheet? Do you really pull stuff that you found out in various industries, galleries, shows, wherever you go to get your inspiration, and then figure out that's your 80%, and then you start tweaking that, and it ultimately can evolve into something that's 150% different than what you started with, versus, this sort of like staring at a blank canvas syndrome that I think we all can get sometimes.
So, I think I work both ways. I'm in an industry where everybody uses mood boards, or Pinterest, or they have their pins or their like inspiration folder, which makes me want to bang my head against the table.
Oh, why?
Because it's like we've gotten so. I feel personally, like mood boards are actually for the people who cannot see it. Right? They're not to explain it to ourselves. They're to explain it to other people. And typically in most of my jobs, I've been hired because they know that I can see it and they're not worried. So it wasn't until it wasn't until very recently that I started doing mood boards for other people. But I don't use them for myself because my personal creative process is I work from what I call a Toni Morrison term. What is a Toni Morrison term? She talks about this idea of rememory, not memory. It's rememory. So in Beloved, one of the characters is walking along the street and gets this vision of another time in another place as though it's actually there, but it seemingly comes out of nowhere. And so she gets this glimpse into a world that is not hers. But is as personal as though it is. And so, I remember I was doing this collection. I had a women's wear line that was super weird, 100% reversible. Everything was reversible. Blouses, skirts, pants. I just love the idea of a 2-for-1. Everybody loves a 2-for. Nobody actually uses it. You buy it because you're like, oh, isn't that novel? I have 2 outfits in one. You always pick a side, you always pick a favorite, but you charge the customer double because it's a 2-for-1, right? So I had this line, and I wanted to move. Like, we've been doing very. It was very traditional, like Macy's price point, very like comfortable for the Midwest, like easy 3/4 length skirts that were reversible, not very inventive. And so I closed my eyes and I was like, I really want to do something that sort of harkens back to the practicality of my grandmother. So my grandmother was a first-generation American from Hungarian immigrants, woman of the land, like lived in New Mexico, Colorado, Arkansas, most of her adult life, raising 5 children and helping my grandfather redo farms. Her aesthetic was this, in my mind's eye, the way that I remember her, she was one of those perfect, like Georgia O'Keeffe-esque, Frida Kahlo-esque, powerful women of the land who wore her battle scars as medallions, as awards. And so I ventured into designing this collection of reversible clothing that was based on what I remember her being, this sort of like wild Western woman. And I never looked at a picture of her because what I saw in my mind's eye is all that needed to serve this collection. All I needed was the feeling that I got from this. And it wasn't like I want cactus print, and I want it to be all like land tones, and that sort of stuff never came into being because with this very clear inspiration in my mind and in my body, I walked into fabric stores, I pulled swatches, I did a few sketches, I did some watercolors, and suddenly this thing was born. Mark Morris, the choreographer, he talks about the way that he approaches choreography, and he always, he says that he uses music that's very familiar because music that he's lived with for a long time, because then he's not trying to invent something. He's realizing something that he's always known. I'm sure he didn't use those words, but that's what I feel he infers by when he talks about using music that he's known for a long time. So it's much easier to choreograph Swan Lake because you've heard it 1,000 times. Like, you've lived with it in the car, you've heard music versions of it on the elevator. Like, you have given it to your children so that they can learn about music. You've seen it, you've listened to it, you've lived it, and now you're choreographing to it because it's so familiar to you, versus something that's like brand new and out of nowhere. It amazes me how I'm always returning to my original influences. I'm always returning to those things like my crazy style inspirations from when I was in high school. I'm like, what? You should have abandoned those in high school. And yet it's so familiar to me. It's so palpable, and so of course I unearthed that.
So I love that because on one level, I almost feel like, me personally, I would feel like that was I'm just taking the easy way out if I'm using that as a crutch because it is something that's so comfortable and so familiar, and that as a creative, like I almost feel myself, as you're saying this, as we're having this conversation right now, I'm in my own head, I'm almost putting this pressure on myself but no, I have to come up with something brand new. I have to be totally inventive from scratch. And you're telling me it's okay to go back to the familiar. And like, I felt this relief. Is that weird? Well, I mean, does that make sense?
No, because, so like, our initial conversation was about, my experience with Illustrator and my team's experience with Illustrator. And I'm like, why wouldn't you use the tools that you know how to use? Right? Like, I am, let's see, is that true? I was about to say I am not an inventor. And that is not true. Because we are all inventive. Right, so my friend Pacey, he's a real mentor for me. He always helps level set, and he was a big deal in the ad world in the 1960s and 70s, and then a big deal in the political world for much longer than that. But we are constantly talking about contemporary art because, I walk into these museums and they just do my head in because they're like, oh, where's the skill? Where's the refinement? But, and then essentially I do contemporary art installation for retail. So it's like the lowest paid version of, contemporary artwork that you can find in the modern world. It's like, it's like, well, wait, you only get paid this much a year, and you're doing these like giant, like multi-city installations. That's crazy. But I digress. So we talk about this idea that really everything's recycled. Everything that we look at is a form that's embellished, or an embellished form that's reduced. And so, you look at like, I'm currently sitting in my dining room, and there are two pieces of furniture. There's a 1930s chinoiserie china cabinet. And then there's this mid-century, very late mid-century, late 60s, early 70s, tube structure chair. And I'm looking at these two things, and I'm like, okay, so here's something that is definitely based on 200 years of hand carving and but made a little more commercial so that it meets an American audience in this like Chinese-esque bureau. And then here's something that's very modern that's still based on 1,000 years of how chairs are made. Like, it still essentially functions as a four-legged thing. Neither of them are new. Both of them feel new to me because of the juxtaposition of them sitting next to each other. Right? That's what we do. Is we, you can walk there was this movement that happened in retail about 10 years ago where retail started becoming much less white box oriented and much more residential. Why? Because it changed the way that customers related to apparel. So they walked into these stores and they would sit down. Like, there was no seating other than by the fitting rooms 10 years ago, unless you were in a very expensive store, and that's because it was a very expensive store that could afford the luxury of that space. But the juxtaposition of creating these comfortable seating environments and putting artwork up that had no relationship to an ad campaign or a piece of product and was just there to make you feel like you were a little more at home, left you feeling your relationship to the product was that you could just buy it and wear it out as though it had just come from your closet, instead of this austere, separate idea of elevated clothing experience, hyper luxury, unattainable, but I must have it. And that was the artistry of somebody who was a visual director or retail professional or creative director, who decided to change that juxtaposition, something familiar but something unfamiliar, or seemingly unfamiliar. So home in a store, weird.
Yeah.
And now that's the only language in which we shop these days. Like, even when you go to Whole Foods nowadays, it's like they have places for you to rest and engage with product in a personal way that didn't exist before.
And so it's almost like we're pulling all of the, it's not the tools, what's the word? All the elements that we're working with, everybody's pulling them out of the same bag, but then it's a matter of how you combine them that makes it unique. The juxtaposition, as you've mentioned many times.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, Jung talks about this. Jung talks, the renowned psychologist Jung talks about the collective unconscious. Right? There's this whole ether of mind that is invisible to us, that we pull from all the time, which is why, like, there's this history of spontaneous, simultaneous invention in the world. Like, the atom bomb's probably the most interesting, because it was invented in Los Alamos, New Mexico, and then 3 days later, it was also invented in Germany.
Mm-hmm.
Like. And this is a very complex thing that's being invented simultaneously, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so Meisner also talks about the collective unconscious, but he talks about it in this way where he's like, so we all pull from the same place, from this creative place. I've come to believe that it's rooted in the idea of nothing in the universe is ever created or destroyed. It's only reused. Like, this is a scientific idea. And so there are all of these ideas out there that we reach into the blind, and as creatives, it's our job to pull them out. We are the messenger from Mount Olympus, bringing it down to the people. That's our role, is to pull the invisible into the visible world. And so, yes, there's this place from which we all pull, and it's how we express it through our unique vision that makes it unique. Mm-hmm. That makes it something that's special and new. Yeah, it's a juxtaposition.
Yeah. I love that. And it's, I actually feel like as a creative, although I do say I tend to lean more business and I think that's a smaller portion of my brain and my instincts are creative, but it's still there. And, I just like that because it really does. And I mentioned this earlier, it takes some weight off my shoulders of this like pressure. I'm like, it's okay. I can use the same materials, the resources, the elements, the inspiration, however you want to call it. And then it's just a matter of how you assemble it to create something new and unique and fresh. It's relieving, honestly.
That's why I love, I referenced Elizabeth Gilbert's book, Big Magic.
Yeah.
to you. And, because everything, as creatives, I feel like we put a great deal of pressure on ourselves to figure everything out. Like, because, it has to come from us, and we feel like, it is our responsibility to design it, stitch it, build it, finish it, pack it, deliver it, and it be all ours. And it be all new, and it be the most inspiring thing you've ever experienced, which is really arrogant. Because one, if we function as if we function in this creative world, we have to remember that we function in a creative world, right? We are not islands. And our job is actually to be collaborative, because if we want the end result to be inspiring, then the process needs to be inspiring as well. So ideally, we're pulling in people who know more than us. And we're pulling in people who take it to the next level, who help us go from 80% to infinite. And we don't worry about the idea being new because it's our idea. And it's something that inspires us, and that's what makes it inspiring. So my current collection of clothing was menswear. It's now much more turning into a unisex and children's line. But one of the things about it is, so I use principally Dutch waxcloth or African fabrics. And I started doing this, 5 years, more than maybe 6 or 7 years ago. And shortly after I started making these, very short run production runs, African fabric or Dutch waxcloth started showing up in a big way in other people's collections. And my first thought was, well, I can't use that anymore. Right? Because now other people are doing it. Why can't I do it? It's no longer new. And it's like, honey, it wasn't new when you picked it up. You picked it up because it inspired you. Like, the history of Dutch waxcloth fabric, which is well worth researching, how it is used in West Africa, how it came to be, really a icon of Africa that's not even African in its heritage, and then how, like, all of that for me was inspiring. That's why I started using it. So why would it matter if somebody else is? And why not explore how I'm using it and not worry about what they're doing? Which is why, for the most part, I try and avoid following fashion. Like, it's much more interesting to look at how the homeless are dressing than how the Kardashians are. Because let me tell you, the homeless, it's amazing what is going on, like, in street style when you have no money. Like, it's just incredible the things that you'll put together versus, like, what your stylist told you to wear.
Yeah.
And so, like, there's no necessity for it to be new. Let it just play.
And okay, I want to go so many directions, and there's a couple things I really do want to talk about. One thing I just want to point out with this comment you make of the Kardashians versus the homeless, which is so fascinating to me, is this concept of constraints within creativity can be your biggest asset. And, you and I touched up on it, or this, I think I could apply it to a conversation you and I had earlier, prior to this conversation, about constraints within your skill set in Illustrator, and how sometimes that makes you mess up or figure out the way this tool works, and you're like, wait, I never knew that's how it would work, and it made you discover something new, versus if you know how to do everything, then, arguably that could just shift your creativity in a different direction. But with the Kardashians and the homeless, the constraints of what they have access to makes them interpret and do things and create things that maybe never would have happened had you had access to everything. And I want to finish on that with one thing that I wanted to bring up earlier, and we got the conversation went a different direction. But this concept of constraints and how it can relate to constraints within time. Because, we talked a lot about planning and having the time to go through the creative process. One of the challenges I have, and I believe other people experience, is almost this curse or the luxury of too much time, and how that can, you start maybe not, there's just like not enough pressure or something, which sounds like a terrible thing to say, but I've experienced it firsthand with many things where I'm almost like, this is the worst. I mean, I feel like a total jerk complaining about this, but I'm like, I have too much time on this, and I'm not being productive. I'm not pushing myself out of my comfort zone as much as I could be because of this luxury or curse of time. I don't know. Does that resonate with you? Have you ever thought about that?
Well, so the founder of Gen Art wrote a book called Fashion Designer's Survival Guide. And she's like, look, before you launch this thing that you are launching, take your time. She's like, when you're in it, when it's like, once it's launched, and she's like, design 2 or 3 seasons while you have the time before it's officially out in the world. She's like, because once you're in it, you're in it. There will be no more time, because now you are not just dealing with the creative aspect, but you're dealing with everything else that goes along with it, the logistics and shipping and making sure that your accounting's all done and making sure that your supply chain's in order. And now you're worried, right? Now you're under the gun. And it seemed like the craziest idea, because it's like, well, I've had the idea, so I'm going to make it, and it's going to be out in the world right now today. It needs to be. But take that time. I mean, I definitely I may be theorizing like right now in real time, but I think there's something to be said about most artists' freshman effort. Especially with some of my favorite authors, like their first book is the one that really thrills me, like the most. And it maybe they wrote it while they were in college, and there wasn't an urgency to it. There was just a desire to write. Like, not a desire, there was a need to put this thing on paper. And so they took their time and they invested in it, and then it had its own life. And you can feel the passion and the brilliance in it. I mean, maybe my favorite example is Toni Morrison, because she writes The Bluest Eye, and it's stunning. Like, it is a stunning piece of literature, and she has had some really incredible. Like, she's a brilliant writer, but there's something that's so wonderful and innocent about The Bluest Eye, because it came from this place that is new and fresh, and that it feels like there's time in it. And actually, one of the themes is time and like what it does to us. But so we all get stuck with urgency. There are things that are urgent. You can't hide it. Somebody is going to come to your desk and be like, I need this tomorrow.
Yeah.
And then you have to go through the system of prioritizing. Thank God for a super corporate life and this thing called the Franklin Covey. I don't know if we all remember that, but Franklin Covey was this, based on Benjamin Franklin's principles of time management and organization. And one of the things that you do is you do this priority matrix. So you have urgent, not urgent, important, not important. And so things can be like urgent and important. Those have to get done immediately. But if it's not urgent and it's important, you can take more time with it. And if it's not urgent and not important, like that could go on for years. And, and so I still use that priority matrix to relieve myself of the stress of urgency. But, and there are these like pet projects that to me are important. And so I increase their level of urgency because they're very important to me, and I feel like they need to be in the world today. And so they move up that priority matrix. And then there are other things that are totally folly, that are just silly things that I'm making just to make. And those can be down at the bottom. And I can play with those for a long time until they're just right and they feel like it's ready to be exposed.
So I want to bring up again the book Big Magic, which you referenced earlier, by Elizabeth Gilbert, and you recommended it to me in a prior conversation, and I'm about halfway through it, and I would highly recommend everybody listening to check it out, either an audiobook or read it. But she talks a lot about going through the creative process for yourself and doing these expressions for yourself, whether it be painting a painting, designing a collection, writing a book, whatever it is. Go through that process and do it for yourself. And the result of that is going to be so much more creatively powerful than if you do that creative process for someone else. Now, obviously, we don't always have the luxury of that. Many of us work in jobs. We have deadlines. We have to meet these time constraints. But when we have the opportunity, and like you said, you have these projects, these pet projects, and I think we all have many of those in our life, give yourself the time and go through that creative process and be selfish about it. That's okay. That's a relief.
Yeah. I mean, so I'm it's interesting that you bring that up specifically. I've been having this conversation with a lot of people lately about why we make, and I do believe that the craft of being creative is a selfish interest. So, I created this backpack many years ago. It's one of the things that actually sold well when I made it. I tend to find that things that I make have a real lag time before they start selling. But this was one of those things where I was living in New York City. My creative studio was in the Brooklyn Navy Yards. I needed something that I could get on my bicycle, ride across the bridge, land in Manhattan, and walk into a business meeting and not feel like a teenager. Right? Because you take a backpack into a business meeting and you feel like a 14-year-old who just, got off the school bus. And it's like, I need something that and I wanted it to feel creative and elegant. It also needed to hold a laptop and a portfolio and materials if I needed. What does that look like? So I made it. And then once it was done, I looked at it and I was like, oh, this is worth making more. This is worth other people fulfilling. This may actually meet other people's needs and not just mine. And for me, that's the selfish of this business. I do. One of the subtle distinctions for me, though, is so I have this very specific definition for art, and not just capital ART art, but everyday, useful, practical, in our world art. And art is an introspective moment taken public. So it's something that I experience inside, an experience that I have that I've now decided to manifest externally and share with other people. It doesn't exist as art until it is something that I've made available to other people. Maybe it's one other person, maybe it's a million other people, but it has to be something that has been shared. Before that, if it's something that I've kept for myself and hidden away, like the songs that I wrote because I learned how to play guitar that I've never shared with anybody, that's just craft. That's just play. That's small works on paper. So I went to this David Hockney retrospective in San Francisco, and I've seen a bunch of David Hockney's major works on public display, and then I found my way into this room that was collections of his sketchbook. So things that he never really meant to be public, that were they were so inspiring. I believe that when they were in his bookshelf, they were practice. They were experimentation. They were craft, just refining his craft. But the moment they were on display, the moment that I was allowed to experience them as a participant in his creative process, they became art. And so there's a selfishness in the craft, but creativity, for me, in the end, has to be selfless. I have to be willing to take it out of the suitcase and let other people experience it. Whether they're going to like it or not, that's none of my business. But there has to be this selfless aspect to it. Otherwise it's just I'm just a Midwestern housewife doing macrame in her basement.
Okay, so this, no.
And no judgment on that.
No.
I love a Midwestern housewife doing macrame in her basement.
That concludes part 1 of my 2-part interview with Solomon. Watch for part 2 next week, where we'll pick up right where we left off, but our conversation shifts from the creative process to overcoming fear. I love the second part just as much as the first, and can't wait for you to hear all the great mindset shifts and insights Solomon introduces us to help us overcome this often crippling emotion. If you'd like to learn more about any of the resources mentioned in this episode, visit the show notes at sfdnetwork.com/23. And since you made it this far, you must have liked the episode. Did you know that the best way you can say thank you and give back is by subscribing and reviewing the show on iTunes? It only takes 60 seconds, but this small effort really helps the show grow and get discovered by more listeners. Visit sfdnetwork.com/subscribe to do that now. I'd really appreciate it. Thanks again for all your support.